Nicholson for his presentation.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to present here at the Homeland Security Conference. Like John mentioned, I am the Response Division Administrator at Homeland Security, and I'm going to talk about critical resources and logistics in disaster response. I'll go ahead and get right into it so we can leave some time for some questions at the end, assuming I can get these slides to work. There we go. So I have 4 easy objectives for the presentation today. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about a critical resource needs assessment, which is essentially the informal process that everybody should really be using once a disaster hits to figure out what you need, what you can get, and how you can get it there. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about state assistance, both what state resources the state of Iowa has to bring to bear to assist locals with disaster response, as well as other resources that can be accessed through the state. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about an example of state resource management, specifically our PPE distribution and management from the COVID-19 event. And then I also want to spend some time talking about some local best practices that we've identified both with COVID-19 event as well as the Derecho response from earlier this fall, late summer. And then finally, we'll conclude the presentation with some next steps on what local jurisdictions can do now to try to get ready for that next disaster and be prepared to integrate state resources into their response. So one overarching note that I want to make before we start talking about ESF7 resource management and logistics is that you'll want to make sure that before you provide any resources to any of your communities or jurisdictions that you have all the proper authorizations in place to provide those resources. There's been a number of different times in the past where we've gotten a resource request from a county and we started moving towards providing that resource only to have to pause and realize that, oh, we don't have a governor's proclamation for that county. So it's important to be familiar with your emergency authorities as a county emergency manager or as a jurisdiction, and to know what you can do under your own authorities and what requires an emergency declaration from an elected official or special emergency authorizations to provide resources. So I just want to caveat the whole presentation with, I'm not going to spend a lot of time about, well, 29C says this and you need a governor's proc for that. It's implied when we're talking about providing these resources that you're following your normal emergency and authorizations to provide those resources. So when a disaster strikes, some of the questions that typically roll around in most people's heads when you're looking at resource management is, the first question is, how do I know what I need, right? Who needs what? What do I already have? What do other people have? How do I get stuff? And then once I get some stuff, how does it get where it needs to go? Those are all excellent questions that really need to be answered in order to effectively provide resources during disaster response. So one of the ways to answer those questions and to really move forward with providing those resources is to conduct what I'm calling a critical resource needs assessment. And this is essentially just an informal process that helps to ensure that resource management functions effectively. And it really has kind of 5 components. First, you're going to need to identify who or where is impacted in your jurisdiction. You're going to need to identify the cause of the impact because that can help provide some valuable information on the proper resource and what resources are going to be available to help support that response. You're going to need to solicit or receive resource requests from those that are impacted. You're going to want to evaluate and validate and deconflict resource needs. And then finally, locate the best resource to meet that need. So let's spend a couple of minutes going through each step in a little bit more detail. So the first step, identify who or where is impacted. Seems like it would be obvious, right? You have a disaster, you immediately know who's impacted, what the impacts are, and where the impacts are, right? But that's actually not how it works. Anybody who's been through a disaster knows that there's the fog of war in the early minutes and hours of any disaster. There are communications challenges. Typically, communications is either disrupted due to damages or it's overwhelmed due to people just simply being busy immediately responding to the disaster, not being able to take your phone call or gather information. There's also a lot of rumors and misinformation that runs around in the early hours of a disaster that really challenges a person's ability to really identify who and where is impacted. So this is something that you need to start working on immediately and get a handle on in order to really effectively provide the right resources to respond. So the next item is identify the cause of the impact. So you can have impacts that are a direct result of the disaster, and then you can have impacts that are an indirect result of the disaster, and both can be cause for providing emergency response resources to the impacted area. You know, an example of a direct result from a tornado or a severe storm event is that you have property damaged or destroyed due to the storm event. An indirect result of that storm event could be that you have power outages, which create a need for a cooling center or a feeding center or shelters, those types of things. Another indirect result of any disaster or large-scale disaster can be the need for a donations warehouse. It's a large-scale, large-scope disaster. A lot of people want to donate things, and you don't have the capability to manage or store those items. So you really essentially want to identify what the cause of the impact is, because that can really help inform what resources you have available to you and what the most appropriate resource is to meet the need. And then finally, and unfortunately, sometimes we need to ask ourselves if these impacts that are being reported or these requests that are coming in, are they disaster related at all? Sometimes we have circumstances where, for instance, you have a disaster and you all of a sudden have a large displaced population that requires sheltering. But in some instances, that displaced population could just be the normal homeless population that didn't have shelter or homes before. You could also have pre-existing damages that existed before the disaster that all of a sudden they come in under the guise of I need response or I need assistance to recover from this disaster, when in reality the damages were pre-existing. So identifying whether or not the impacts are disaster related or not is an important step in figuring out how to provide the appropriate resource. So the next step is you're going to want to solicit or receive resource requests from those impacted. Those resource requests will come in by phone, by email, in person, through Twitter, through Facebook, every way you can imagine those resource requests will come in. Sometimes though, you do need to ask. Sometimes you actually have to solicit resource requests from those. Once you've identified the areas that are impacted, you know the cause of the impact, you may need to go out and ask your communities or the impacted population if they need help, because sometimes they're just overwhelmed and they just haven't had a moment to even ask for help. So you're also going to want to establish a standard process for resource requests. And this is a theme that I'm going to hit on kind of over and over again through today's presentation. Is a standard process is key. If you don't have a standard process for resource requests, you or your team is going to be overwhelmed with requests coming from all angles and all different entities. And even when you do establish that standard process, you also need to remain flexible and understand that non-standard requests will still come in. But having an established process, a defined process that you can redirect those non-standard requests to, will ensure that nothing is missed, that your team or whoever you have handling those resource requests, if you have other people handling them, are aware and kept informed, and that the requests are processed in a timely fashion. Part of your standard process is that you're going to want to make sure that you gather what are considered essential elements of information early on in the request or immediately when the request is made, so that you can have all the information you need to process that request. Some of these essential elements of information include, what is the mission? Asking the requester, what have they already attempted to do? That can save a lot of time because you don't want to waste your time going down a path trying to find a resource that they've already tried to get and they can't get. Another question to ask is, what do you think you need? What is the actual resource that you're looking for? Where do you need it? When is it needed? And this one's important. Who is the point of contact for the resource request? You'll need a name and you'll need a good 24/7 number for that point of contact, because at the point when you take the request, you don't know if it's an immediate need, if it's something that's going to come in the middle of the night, or if it's going to come in during business hours. You haven't figured any of that out. So you're going to want to make sure that you have good contact for whoever's making that request, so you can follow up and coordinate that resource to them. So the next step is to evaluate and validate and or deconflict the resource needs. So this part is absolutely necessary. All requests have to be validated, and you'll want to build that into your workflow and process for taking resource requests. If you have a team that's assisting in taking resource requests, ensure that they are trained to ask the right questions up front, including, like I mentioned, what has the requester already done, so that you can save time. Another item is to deconflict. If you get multiple requests from the same jurisdiction, but maybe different people in that jurisdiction that seem a little too similar, or they may be trying to solve the same problem, take a couple of minutes to try to deconflict. If you get the sense that two parties within one of your communities aren't talking to one another, take the time to deconflict so that you don't duplicate the resource that you're bringing in for that entity. You know, it's worth spending 5 minutes validating a request up front instead of spending 5 hours of wasted effort sourcing a resource that ultimately isn't needed or is duplicative. So the next step is to then locate the best resource to meet the need. So once again, what is the mission? And when can the resource be available? That's part of getting those essential elements of information answered, knowing what their timing is. A lot of times they'll say, I need it as soon as possible. Okay, but are you going to need it 48 hours from now, or do you just need it immediately? Because if you can't bring the resource in until for 2 days, then there's no sense in bringing the resource in at all potentially. But once you know the mission and the essential elements of information, it makes it a lot easier to identify the best resource. And that resource that you identify may or may not be what the requester had in mind. You may have a better or more effective solution that can be provided that the requester may not have even known was an option or resource that was available to them. But the key thing is that if there's a change in the resource that's going to be provided from what was requested, you're going to want to circle back with that requester, confirm that they can make that alternative resource work. Because even though you believe that this resource is ideal and that's what you can bring in, if you don't circle back with the requester and say, hey, this is what I'm bringing you, then they may not be able to make use of it. Also, partially meeting a need is often better than providing nothing at all, but not always. So that's another thing that you're going to want to circle back with the original requester on. If you're only able to partially meet the need with your resources, close that loop with them. And then finally, just in general, once you've identified what resource you can bring in, close the loop with the requester and make sure that they understand what resource they're getting and that they can accept and integrate the resource into their response. So next, I'm going to go ahead and talk about some state resources or state resource requests, and I've kind of broken these into kind of 6 different categories. If you're requesting resources from the state, you may get what I call state stuff, which is state equipment or state agency resources. You may get resources from various partnerships that the state has established with private sector partners and other nonprofits. You may receive assistance with local mutual aid, and I'll go into that in a little bit more detail here in a couple minutes. The resource you receive might be a resource from another state that the state has obtained through state-to-state mutual aid. It could be a federal resource that's obtained through direct federal assistance requests, or it could be a volunteer resource. These volunteer resources, which are sometimes overlooked, but can oftentimes be a significant force multiplier in a disaster response. So let's go ahead and spend a moment going through each of these categories and just spend a little bit more time on each one. So state stuff. I'll start with HSMD owned equipment. I know for those of you that attended our conference in years past, we spent time going in detail about the state resources and equipment we have. That's not what I'm going to do here. I'm just going to hit it at a high level to talk about some of the stuff that HSCMD has that we built over the last 10 years or so. And I'll start with our primary equipment, which is pumps. We have 97 pumps. We have 17 generators. We have 3 sandbagging machines, just over 1 million sandbags on hand, and currently we have about 1,400 linear foot of HESCO barrier. So HSCMD resources are primarily staged in partnership with local EMAs and other state agencies across the state. Our resource management strategy is intentionally decentralized to allow for rapid or immediate response by our local partners, where they can leverage those state resources that are staged with or near them as needed as they respond locally. Our staged equipment is typically governed by a memorandum of understanding that outlines the roles and responsibilities of each party with regard to maintaining and deploying that equipment. So next, I'll go ahead and talk about our most heavily used piece of equipment in our inventory, which is our pumps. So our pumps are distributed across the state, as you can see in the map in the upper right-hand corner. We currently have 18 3-inch pumps, 45 4-inch pumps, 26 6-inch pumps, 4 8-inch pumps, and 4 12-inch pumps staged all across the state. Our larger pumps, the 6s and the 8s, are trailer mounted, and you can see in the lower right there's an image of what the 6-inch pumps look like. They're capable of moving a good amount of water, and they're a very handy resource to have during floods. Our large diameter diesel pumps, so we consider that anything 6-inch or 8-inch pump, all have a remote monitoring system installed on them. And the remote monitoring system can provide real-time alerts, engine status, hours, location, and other data. In the upper left, you'll see the mapping application within that monitoring system that shows us the real-time location of our large diameter diesel pumps. And then in the lower right, we have remote monitoring capability to monitor RPMs, oil pressure, engine temperature, battery voltage, all kinds of metrics about the pump. We know when they're started, when they're turned off, all those things. So that's a valuable resource for us to have kind of that real-time situational awareness of where the pumps are and which ones are running and which ones aren't. So next, we'll talk about generators. The state has a fleet of 17 generators that were particularly useful this year with the derecho response. Our generators range from 35 kW to 150 kW in size. They're all diesel generators and they're all 3-phase. You can see from the map in the upper left-hand corner that we have the generators staged out strategically across the state for somewhat even distribution across the state to provide access to everybody as needed. The generators are also equipped with a remote monitoring system, similar to what we have on our pumps. The remote monitoring system reports out location, hours, engine status, battery status. The system will also provide GPS breadcrumbs so that we can see where the pump or where the generators have been. And the system can also provide various analytics on generator usage, which you see in that lower right-hand corner. You can provide analytics based on a single unit or a group of units over a defined period of time, and it looks at things like run hours and those types of things. Right now, in the upper right-hand corner, that's our real-time map as of, I think, yesterday or a couple days ago with our generators, and it doesn't really reflect the staging map because most of our generators right now are sitting in Altoona getting preventative maintenance based on the heavy use that they received over the derecho event. So in addition to our pumps and generators, we also have sandbags that are staged at 6 locations across the state, totaling just over 1 million sandbags. We have HESCO barrier that is staged in 2 locations across the state. And we recently acquired 3 sandbagging machines that are awaiting placement across the state. We intend to stage those across the state as well. So let's talk about other state agency resources besides just HSCMD-owned equipment for disaster response. Some of the other items that HSCMD can bring to bear are state specialty teams, including our WMD hazmat teams, WMD tactical teams, urban search and rescue team, our SAW team, our building inspectors, the incident management team, and others that we can bring to bear and deploy into a disaster area as needed and requested. We also have the DOT typically provides debris removal assistance and transportation of resources during an event. The Department of Public Health can provide medical assets like the PPE that we have been providing over the COVID event, as well as medical response teams, disaster medical assistance team, or DMORT teams, and other resources. Our DNR partners can provide law enforcement assistance. They do have sworn law enforcement officers that can supplement law enforcement operations as needed. And they also have access to boats and access to waterways as needed. Department of Public Safety through the State Patrol can provide law enforcement assistance. Their Fusion Center can provide intelligence information for disaster response. And then the State Patrol does maintain a fleet of fixed wing aircraft that can provide search and rescue assistance as needed. The Department of Corrections can provide inmate labor for cleaning up disaster debris or for filling sandbags. The Department of Human Services can provide, has the disaster behavioral health response team that can provide mental health counseling assistance to impacted communities during disasters. And they can also, they're also responsible for providing disaster case management across the state to help those impacted residents recover from a disaster. And then finally, the National Guard is our utility player. They have specialized aerial assets, rotary wing assets, as well as personnel that can perform any number of missions. The National Guard serves as a support function in almost all ESFs in our response plan, and they can provide various levels of support, whether it be transportation assistance, manpower assistance, those types of things. So the next category of state support that can be provided is private partnership resources. So the state has established relationships with regional and national partners like Hy-Vee, Fairway, Come and Go, Walmart, Casey's, Target, Lowe's, Home Depot, and other private entities that are often very eager to support their communities during times of disaster. The way they typically support is they often donate food and water for sheltering operations or for disaster responders. They'll also donate or provide consumables and supplies, rakes, cleanup buckets, bleach, sponges, those types of things to help with flood response or other disaster cleanup operations. Many of our convenience store partners have their own fuel hauling capability, and we've engaged in discussions with them about hauling fuel as needed in large scale disasters like what we saw with the Derecho. And then a lot of times they also are eager to provide sheltering or to support sheltering and feeding operations. Hy-Vee in particular has been very active in moving their mobile food truck and providing meals out to disaster responders and shelters over the last several disasters. So most of these partners they enable their store managers to authorize donations right from their individual stores. And they also encourage their store managers to establish those relationships with local emergency management and local officials. So the state is not the only mechanism that you can access resources like this from. We encourage local emergency managers to reach out and establish these relationships with your local companies that work in your area because they can prove to be very beneficial during disaster response. So some other resource support that the state can provide is in the form of essentially technical assistance. So we have local mutual aid assistance in Iowa. That's the Iowa Mutual Aid Compact, or IMAC. And one thing to note is that HSEMD is not a signatory to IMAC. So any resources that we provide are not through IMAC. However, we can assist with guidance, and we can also advertise your needs through IMAC via Alert Iowa. In practice, the way that works is essentially an emergency manager can call the duty officer and say, I'm looking for this through local mutual aid. I don't know who has it. Can you help? We can issue a broadcast via Alert Iowa to all the county coordinators in the state saying, Coordinator XYZ is looking for this. Please contact the coordinator. So we can help advertise your need through local mutual aid if you don't know where to find it. We can also provide technical assistance and troubleshooting with sending out Alert Iowa alerts. As you guys are most likely, as many are aware, the Alert Iowa program is administered, managed through our office, and we have staff that are subject matter experts on troubleshooting and sending Alert Iowa alerts. The state of Iowa can also provide assistance with various research and guidance. We have partners like the Department of Cultural Affairs. We have historical preservation subject matter experts. Obviously, our recovery division can serve as subject matter experts on federal PA guidance, PA and IA guidance, and then we have various other state agency subject matter experts that can provide guidance on federal programs. And I know there are some questions coming in. I'd like to hold them all till the end if I could, and then I'll go ahead and get the questions answered one by one once I complete the presentation. Also, we have state-to-state mutual aid, or the Emergency Management Assistance Compact, or EMAC. This is, as I mentioned, is the ability for a state to request resources from other states and bring them in to help support state or local response. And that's a resource that can be accessed by the state of Iowa as well. So another resource that can be accessed through the state is direct federal assistance. This is exactly like it sounds. It is direct support from a federal agency. And some of the more common direct federal assistance requests that we see are through FEMA. We may ask for generators, water, other disaster response supplies and equipment. The Environmental Protection Agency, they can assist with what we call orphan drum recovery during flood events typically. And they also have what's called the Aspect Plane, which is an aerial platform that has remote sensing capabilities to identify hazardous materials releases associated with the disaster response. We can bring in experts from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, can provide technical expertise, whether it be for foreign animal disease or crop issues. And then we also have the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that can provide flood engineers for flood fight assistance, as well as debris removal assistance. And then finally, the last category of assistance is volunteer resources. The state can assist and access the IDHRC, the Iowa Disaster Human Resource Council. They can provide assistance with unmet needs for disaster survivors. We also work closely with Volunteer Iowa, which can help to coordinate and organize volunteers that are eager to assist impacted communities. They can also coordinate those personnel resources for disaster cleanup operations and other needs that you might have that volunteers could meet. We have established relationships with various national volunteer groups, for instance, Team Rubicon, that can provide personnel and cleanup assistance. And then finally, we work closely with faith-based partners as well. And these faith-based partners can be local groups as well as regional and national organizations, depending on the size and scope of the disaster, that can provide assistance with cleanup operations and volunteer and donations management. So with that, I'll go ahead and move on to our use case, which is the evolution of state PPE management and distribution during the COVID-19 response. So going back in time to March 2020, at the beginning of the pandemic, we looked at our current supplies of PPE that we had on hand, and it was very limited. We also knew that there was priority allocation that was occurring through the Strategic National Stockpile, and that Iowa was unlikely to receive a large allocation through that Strategic National Stockpile. For instance, if we look at some of the data of the PPE that we have received since March 1st, so from March 1st to October 1st, approximately 1.6% of the total supply of PPE in Iowa was sourced through the Strategic National Stockpile. An additional 1% of PPE that we have obtained was sourced through FEMA, leaving the remaining 97.4% of all PPE obtained between March and October was obtained through state procurement, essentially. So understanding that there would be limited resources from the SNS, we knew that we were going to have to bust out the credit cards and start buying PPE just as fast as we could, but we also knew that there was severe strain, and there continues to be strain on the national and international supply chain for PPE. The strain on supply really evolved over time. At first, in March, it was procedure masks that were difficult to obtain. Then it transitioned to face shields and sanitizer. Luckily, a lot of manufacturers shifted their operations and began producing face shields and sanitizer to meet the needs, so that strain on supply was alleviated at that point. Very soon after face shields and sanitizer, it became gowns. Disposable gowns, cloth gowns were very difficult to obtain, and in some cases can still be difficult to obtain depending on the level of gown that you're looking for. And then most recently, nitrile gloves are the hot ticket item, the hardest item to procure for PPE, and that continues today and is expected to continue in the months to come. So based on the situation that we were faced with in March, we knew that we had a simultaneous need statewide from everybody for PPE, and it was going to require a number of different things from our ESF7, from our logistics group. We knew we were going to need a warehouse for receipt and storage of PPE. We were going to need a defined request process and parameters for PPE, because we knew that the requests were going to be numerous and were going to be extended. So we wanted to define that request process and establish some parameters. We knew that we needed a distribution mechanism and resources to distribute the PPE to those that needed it. We knew that we were going to have to establish a tracking and accountability system for that PPE. And we also knew that we needed to be able to project for our intermediate and long-term needs based on the severe strain to the international supply chain. So let's dive a little bit deeper into each one of these items real quick. So warehouse for receipt and storage, how did that evolve? So initially, the state stockpile of PPE was stored at a small Department of Public Health warehouse in the Des Moines metro area. IDPH very quickly activated their contingency contract for SNS storage and distribution, which I like to call the worst kept secret in the state of Iowa at this point, of where that warehouse is and who that partner is. But nonetheless, I'm not going to say who that is, but they did activate that contingency contract for storage and distribution of supplies. Eventually, the state's supply of PPE exceeded the capacity and capability of that contingency contract warehouse, so the state was required to lease a secondary warehouse, which we still currently lease and where the majority of our PPE supplies are stored today. So the next item with the evolution of state PPE management is the defined request process and parameters. So originally and from the beginning, we knew that we wanted state PPE to be accessed via local or by locals via the county EMAs. That would be the only way that a local entity could access state PPE. So we wanted to clamp that down right away. We also knew that the mechanism to request that by a local EMA was through a WebEOC mission task. So if I'm a data guy, I'm a numbers person. So let's talk about some numbers with WebEOC real quick. So as of yesterday, as of October 13th, we have 3,960 missions in WebEOC. 2,061 of those are for PPE, 1,193 are for other resources, 209 missions for general inquiry, 223 missions related to testing, and 274 missions that are just generic. The typical large-scale disaster has about 150 to 300 missions. So that gives you a sense of the scope and size of this event on WebEOC and on resource management. So if we look at the high water mark for missions in WebEOC, that was April 2nd, 2020. There were 82 missions on April 2nd that were submitted. And if we look at the average daily number of missions every day for the duration of the event since March, we average about 20 missions a day in WebEOC. So if we look at eligible uses versus ineligible uses, we knew we needed to identify and define what was eligible for state PPE and what was not. And unfortunately, we had a lot of different stakeholders, and it wasn't a broad brushstroke or one-size-fits-all scenario. So we had guidance for long-term care facilities, for instance, on who was eligible for PPE and who wasn't, and that evolved over time. We had guidance for first responders, who could get it and who couldn't. We had guidance for schools, guidance for dentist offices, guidance for hospitals, guidance for food processors, guidance for funeral homes, and so on and so forth, because the scenarios were constantly evolving for each different stakeholder group, and it was also evolving based on the supply we had on hand. We also established some prerequisites for access to state PPE, and those prerequisites included things like the entity requesting PPE needed to be on PPE conservation, they needed to be attempting to procure on their own, so on and so forth, and a lot of those prerequisites still exist today. We also established some guidance on request parameters, how we needed the request to come in so that we could effectively and efficiently fill those requests from the warehouse. The request parameters evolved over time based on our supply that we had available in our warehouse. So for instance, initially, we wanted the request to just be for 3 days of supply. And then we were able to increase that to 7 days supply. And then we were able to increase that to 14 days supply. We also provided evolving guidance as our inventory and stock grew to include guidance on request specific sizes, whether it be for gloves or gowns or whatever it might be. Request specific types of PPE, either disposable or cloth, for instance. As we would get new categories of PPE like sanitization products in, we would put out more guidance to say, okay, now we have this available, ask for it like this, separate it out from that. Durable medical equipment versus PPE, those types of things. It was constantly evolving, and we were providing new guidance almost on a weekly or daily basis in some instances on our resource request process. So distribution mechanism and resources. So in a nutshell, I like to summarize this as first it was small stuff, small shipments of PPE. And IDPH ran the first delivery of PPE for this event. And it was typically IDPH or the State Patrol that would run this PPE initially. Then as our inventory grew and the requests grew, we started moving more stuff, and we engaged the National Guard to help provide transportation resources and distribution support for that PPE. Initial shipments were on allocation. We'd get a request for 100 gowns and we could only provide 20, for instance. Our average allocation at the beginning was about 20% of the request is what we were able to provide. As our inventory levels grew, we were able to provide 50% of the requests, and then it was 70% of the request. And eventually, as our inventory levels stabilized and grew, we could provide 100% of the request that was being requested, as long as it was an eligible request. Eventually, the National Guard stepped up and continued to provide more stuff all the time. At one point, we were averaging about between 30 and 40 deliveries a day, every day, 7 days a week, where we were providing resources to local partners. That slowed down eventually, and it transitioned into what I call special stuff, or special distributions. And these are things like pushing out 30-day stockpiles to the counties, for instance, or pushing out schools PPE, elections PPE, which we've done twice now. Cloth masks for schools is the latest special distribution that we've done. And we've also done special distributions, for instance, working with our grocer partners to provide cloth masks for the public back in May. We had a special distribution for that as well. I anticipate there'll probably be more special distributions as the fall progresses and we move into winter as well. Eventually, now what I like to call, we're in the mode where we're providing routine stuff. And right now it's the DOT. We've transitioned our distribution model where we have 6 district inventories that are resupplied by the central warehouse. So the deliveries that you're receiving now are probably coming from your DOT district inventory versus from our central warehouse in the Des Moines metro area. And that distribution model may change again in the future. It may evolve as our needs and requests evolve. So tracking and accountability. In March 2020, it started with manual spreadsheet and manual analysis of mission task. On the left, you can see there's an image of PPE distribution as of March 25th. At that time, we had 45 total distributions to 37 counties, and that information was basically manually entered based on mission tasks and WebEOC. The invoice that everybody signs when they receive state PPE was a manual template that was created manually each time based on what was picked from the supplies. So this process eventually over time evolved into a massive Google sheet essentially that tracks everything from real-time inventory across multiple warehouses. It serves as a transactional database to in-process new inventory, to document the resupply of field locations. It serves as a delivery tracking and queuing mechanism. It automatically generates invoices. It provides cost summaries. It provides transport summaries. And all of that data within that Google environment is also leveraged using Google Data Studio for data visualizations, which is what you see on the right on your screen. We use a logistics dashboard that can tell us everything from where our deliveries have gone, where our inventory is, where our ordering is at, timelines for delivery or receipt of new orders, our cost analysis. We use Google Data Studio for all of that to provide that data visualization. The last component that we knew we needed to do, which was supply projections. We knew based on the strain on the logistics system that we needed to be projecting out what our needs were 30 days, 60 days, 90 days in advance and placing those orders because that was how long it was taking to get resources. So the early numbers were all over the place due to our lack of guidance and structure around what requests needed to look like. Some requests came in and they were for a year's worth of N95s. Some requests came in for 7 days worth of N95s, and it wasn't specified. It was just a number. So we provided some more guidance and structure, some more parameters around those requests, and that allowed us to refine those requests. The week of April 6th was our high point, was a peak for requests to the state. 1.5 million individual items were requested that week. So we looked at every week, we took the statewide request data from WebEOC and we compiled it. And those requests informed procurement, informed what our current need was, and it was averaged out over time. Eventually, the commercial supply chain was partially restored, and we received figures from the federal government on how many items were being provided by the commercial suppliers in the state. Those figures also helped to inform our future orders. We also worked closely with the Department of Administrative Services and their procurement team to monitor national and international supply chains that helped inform our orders, to help predict where we were going to see pinch points in the supply chain so that we could place our orders before it became a problem. We still continue to hold weekly meetings where we monitor our inventory, we monitor supply orders that are still yet to come in, we track them to make sure they're going to come in on time, and we look out into the future to see what we're going to need or where we're going to have issues. We've implemented a number of sustainment orders for high demand items, including N95s, disposable gowns, and nitrile gloves, where we'll have routine regular shipments and resupply of these items in the months to come. And then we're also looking to the future. In fact, just the other day, we asked DAS to order a number of vaccine supplies so that we'd have some on hand in case they were needed. So next, I want to take a minute to go over a couple of local best practices that we've observed, both for the COVID-19 event as well as for the Derecho event. And I want to give props. I did ask a handful of counties in the state to provide me some information, and I do want to say that I could spend an hour on each one of these counties and what they did, what they accomplished from an ESF7 resource management standpoint. I'm only going to touch on each one of these counties' efforts and talk about what makes them unique, but I know for a fact that each one of these county coordinators would be more than happy to discuss these items at length and provide some assistance to anybody who needed some help with ESF7 or resource management. So I'll start with Pottawatomie County and their COVID-19 efforts. So in Pottawatomie County, they've supported 116 organizations and they've delivered 365,000 items within the county. One of the key items to their success in Pottawatomie County was the required completion of a standard request form. And they also instituted a standard process for comprehensive tracking. So this standard process included things like the tracking system they have included live inventory. They could track donations. They were able to track incoming shipments. They were able to track their requests, and they were also able to track distribution records of things that had gone out the door. One of the other unique items that Pottawatomie County attributes to their success is the establishment of priority groups. So they established 3 distinct groups, and each group had a different request deadline, where if you were in group 1, you needed to have your request in by Sunday at 6 p.m. If you were in group 2, it was Tuesday at 6 p.m. Likewise, they would put those requests into the state or to their suppliers at defined periods each week so that it was an organized and well-oiled machine. The 3 priority groups were essentially divided into group 1 might be hospitals, EMS, fire, law, and different health clinics. Group 2 could be LTCs, medical examiner and jails. Group 3 might be hospice care, rehabilitation facilities, maybe area education agencies. Another item that they touted as key to their success was evolving and leveraging technology and forms more as the event progressed into fall. Originally, it was a paper request form or a PDF form, and they've evolved their request form to a Google form where it can be submitted electronically now. And then finally, customer service was a key to their success. And for them, customer service meant being flexible, establishing that trust and relationship with their partners to provide that level of service. So if we look at some examples of what Pottawatomie County has done, the one on the left is an example of their logistics support update that they provided. As you can see, that's a 4-page update. It goes through everything from what's available to what the grouping is, the priority groupings, and what the timeframes are for submission. In the middle, you see a resource request form. This is their new online Google form that's used for ICS 213 resource requests. Now on the right, you can see a couple examples of their data report outs from their inventory and their resource tracker template that they use. So next, I'm going to jump over to Johnson County. Johnson County credited a lot of their success to pre-established partnerships with stakeholders, both from a staffing perspective and the EOC, because they had limited staffing EOC due to the environment. They had pre-established partnerships with partners and trained partners to facilitate resource management. And they also had pre-established relationships with industry for the supply stream, which was very beneficial for Johnson County in particular in the early days of the event, where others may have struggled with supply because they had pre-established accounts, pre-established relationships for those supplies. They were able to obtain them perhaps when others were not. They did leverage technology, but they were not afraid to use paper, and you'll see some examples of that here on the next slide. Johnson County is a little bit unique in that they are well prepared with their supplies and equipment caching. Johnson County has stuff, and they routinely cache stuff. And then they have a requirement for an established process, not just for their stakeholders that are requesting, but also for their staff that are managing the resource request process. They have established requirements that everybody must fall into and meet in order for the system to work smoothly. So I mentioned that they weren't afraid of paper forms. On the lower left, you can see two examples of ICS 213s, the general message form, as well as the resource request form. So these were used and needed to be used to be flexible and to effectively process a request. But then on the upper part of the screen, you can see where they've used Crisis Track, and they've also used Google Sheets on their own to track and account for their PPE supply and inventory. I mentioned that Johnson County has participates in equipment and supply caching. On the lower right, you can see what appears to be N95s that they have cached, or they had cached for this event. And then another thing that was unique to Johnson County is they actually had 40 ventilators cached and in inventory for this event that were available and were able to be used, not just in Johnson County, but they also provided those ventilators through IMAC to other counties as well. Next, we'll jump over to Scott County. Scott County used a technology tracking system and a clearly defined structure that they credit for some of their success there for COVID-19. They also had great partnerships. They have what's called the Quad Cities Coalition, and they also established a logistics oversight committee that would meet weekly. Their coalition and the logistics oversight committee assisted with group purchasing, and they also sourced local vendors to generate what we call third-party PPE or homemade hand sanitizer, face shields, those types of things. The pre-established relationships that Scott County had through previous exercises with their CMS partners really allowed for open lines of communication, and it also created a basis of trust with those partners, which just made the resource management process go that much smoothly. And then they also talked about compartmentalizing their disasters. Scott County had a flare-up of civil unrest along with many other communities in the state this year. And during that civil unrest, they were able to obtain various resources like water, radios, software, food. They were able to process state requests for assistance, and they did that separately and simultaneously with their COVID logistics team, because the COVID stuff didn't stop just because there was civil unrest. So some examples from Scott County, clear communications and guidance that was issued by Scott County. You can see that from the lower right. You have their resource request and disbursement procedure, which is a number of pages. You have their demobilization plan, an example of that. And then you also have various flow charts that show the process for requesting resources as well as expected timelines for turnaround. You see where they use Salamander Live. They leveraged that technology, and they had specific instructions or guidance for the completion of the ICS 213 RR form. In some of the images you see in the upper or in the lower right, you see that was a pallet of donated PPE. And that's typically how donated PPE will come, especially if it's in small batch quantities, is it comes in looking like that. And then eventually you integrate it into your overall PPE supply, which is what you can see a portion of that from Scott County up on the upper right. And then finally, not to hit on the COVID-19 entirely, the Derecho event in Lynn County, they had a defined resource request form and procedure, but they emphasized that you need to be flexible, which is absolutely true. They emphasized tracking and follow-up, which is key. Make sure that requests are followed through and include that follow-through process in your workflow for the team that's working resource requests. Also, high demand items that they had, for instance, generators during the derecho, they created a prioritization scheme where priority 1 was life safety, priority 2 was critical infrastructure support, and then priority 3 was everything else. And they had to do that prioritization scheme based on limited resources. So some examples of some of the documents and forms that Lynn County used included this, their resource request form, which was instructions specifically on what goes in each field. And then you can see on the right, there's an actual copy of that form specifically from Lynn County. So wrapping up, next steps, what to expect from state resources. I know many of you on the line have probably heard this before, but you won't need to define the mission, not the resource. So what is the mission? What are you trying to accomplish? Don't call in and say, I need the National Guard. Talk about what you're trying to do. You're trying to monitor levees, or you're trying to clean up debris. So define the mission, not the resource. The next thing to be aware of is know how to use WebEOC. WebEOC is the mechanism to request state resources. It's the mechanism to document it. So be familiar with WebEOC, how to use it, make sure you know how to use it and you can get in there to use it. Be flexible. That's something that was a key component from all of the local examples, is be flexible. Use a standard request form and process, establish relationships in advance, use technology when it makes sense, and always have clear communications with your partners is some of the common themes from our local best practices, and it's something that we can't hit on enough from the state levels. Everybody's program is going to be better off if they follow kind of those key tenets. And then finally, have a plan for resource integration. If you're going to request state resources, be ready to integrate those state resources or private resources or federal resources or whatever they may be into your response. State, federal, private resources are there to supplement and support your local response, and so you want to make sure that you have a plan to integrate those resources. What to expect from, or what should you be doing now, or what could you be doing now? So one thing that's clear from our local best practices is the need to build partnerships. Build those partnerships now with local entities, with your communities, with your response partners, with your private sector partners. Build those partnerships now. Also, train EOC logistics responders. Many county EMAs are a one-person shop or a part-time EMA, so you're going to need to work with your other county agencies and county entities that can help support your EOC operations during disaster and train up that logistics group. Develop tracking tools and processes now so that you don't have to develop them on the fly. Go ahead and prepare your communications, your ESF, whether that's an ESF7 annex, whether that's guidance that you want to put out on how to complete the your ICS 213RR form. Prepare those communications now so that you can fire those off in a timely fashion during an event. Do your THIRA, do your threat hazard identification risk analysis now. Identify your gaps. That's the way that you can essentially do that needs assessment now so that you're not trying to play catch up after disaster strikes. And then finally, prepare some checklists and resource packages to help guide you so that you can rapidly request resources when needed. So with that, I know we're getting a little bit tight on time. I wanted to leave some time for question and answer. And so I'll go into there. First question I see is from Austin Seeley. Can you please specify what the state's preference is in regard to how far a local entity tries to procure goods resources on their own before requesting state assistance? It looks like for their smallest community, they lack the personnel to attempt to procure the resources, while larger communities have some capacity. What is the happy medium of an attempt to procure before coming to the state? More local jurisdictions are simply asking for state help without making their own attempt, which obviously depletes resources quickly. So, I mean, AJ, that's a case-by-case basis, and you know your local jurisdictions better than anybody else. But what I could say as general guidance is that they need to be attempting to procure on their own. We've been saying that from March and April, and we know that it's difficult, and we don't want to point anybody to unreliable vendors, but there needs to be some demonstrated attempt to procure on their own. The state's PPE inventory is designed to fill gaps. It's not designed to be relied upon for PPE. We don't want anybody to be relying on the state's PPE because it will not be there forever. By filling gaps, what we'd like to see is if you have a local entity that has, is trying to place an order for gloves, for instance, but they're not going to arrive for 8 weeks and they need gloves in 2 weeks, then we can help fill that gap, but they should still place that order for gloves. And they should place maybe a larger order than they were going to place before for gloves, so that in 8 weeks they get their supply. And then a week from now, place another order and it'll get there 9 weeks. Place another order, continue to place orders, get that pipeline going themselves, and then the state's PPE can meet that gap in between. All right, we have a comment from Dutch about Safeguard Iowa partnership that can also provide assistance to the private sector. That's absolutely right, Dutch. Thank you for that. Safeguard Iowa partnership is a resource for local EMAs to tap into those private sector resources as well. We have a question from Brian Paul. We're requesting inmate labor crews. Do we need to be specific to the number of personnel being requested, or are they already divided into a set number of people per crew? The answer is yes. They do divide them into people per crew. Typically what we'll do for an inmate request is that we'll scope the mission. We'll try to get a feel for how much debris, for instance, needs to be removed or whatever the labor crew is. And then we'll let corrections basically define how many, depending on how many supervisors they have and how many available inmates they have, they will determine how many crews come. So no, you don't need to be specific that I need one 20-person crew or two 10-person crews. Essentially just frame it saying I need assistance with debris removal. And then we'll work through the dynamics of what that looks like, how long the mission will last, how many people corrections is able to provide. And then looks like finally, an anonymous attendee asked, are there any strategies pending for replacing the services Red Cross cannot provide anymore? This has been kind of a hot topic over the last year or so, and I know the Red Cross has gone through a number of different restructurings, and they are attempting to define what their service levels are in each different community. At this point, I can't say that there's a specific strategy in place for replacing the services Red Cross can provide, but I will say that that is a big part of conducting your THIRA and identifying your gaps there. If the Red Cross has indicated that they're no longer able to provide a certain service in your area, you're going to want to incorporate that into your threat hazard identification risk assessment and identify that as a gap, and then build your resources up to fill that gap. And obviously you can work with the state to try to leverage some of our partnerships that we have with similar organizations that can provide services like shelter assistance, feeding, and those types of things. So with that, I don't see any additional questions. So I think I will thank everybody for their time. I know I'm coming up on 10 o'clock and we have another presenter. So thank you everybody for taking the time to listen to the presentation. I hope it was useful. Please don't hesitate to reach out to our office if you have any additional questions following this presentation.